Well, welcome everybody and good afternoon. A very warm welcome to our online book launch to mark the first publication of a brand new venture, the Royal Armouries Research Series. It's a series published by Boydell and Brewer in association with the Royal Armouries, and it's a forum for the study of arms and armour and associated subjects from antiquity right up to the present day. My name is Martyn Lawrence. I'm the publishing manager at the Royal Armouries, and I'm joined today by the editors of the book, Dr. Alan Murray, Senior Lecturer in Medieval Studies at the University of Leeds, and Karen Watts, former Senior Curator of Armour and Art, and now Curator Emeritus, which is an almighty mouthful, at the Royal Armouries Museum. Now, we would have loved to welcome you to the museum this afternoon to spend some time with you, perhaps even to show you some of the tournament objects that feature in the book, which we're talking about. As it is, we would welcome your questions. Please use the chat function on YouTube, and I can then put your questions to the editors as we go through the session. Now, because you're joining us through the Royal Armouries, there's a decent chance you know who we are, but just in case you don't, Royal Armouries is the UK's national museum of arms and armour, and it's one of the oldest museums in the world. In some form, the Royal Armoury has been welcoming visitors since the restoration of the monarchy under Charles II, and there's a case to be made that we've been doing that since the days of Elizabeth I. The main museum is in Leeds, and we are now open. You can come and visit us again if you pre-book, and you can also visit our collections, view them in the White Tower at the Tower of London, our historic home, and at Fort Nelson near Portsmouth, the home of the National Collection of Artillery. Now, the publishing programme at the Royal Armouries is small but beautiful, unlike the publishing department that you're looking at the moment, which is going grey prematurely. But we publish facsimiles, illustrated introductions to our subjects, exhibition catalogues, guidebooks, gift books. Our aim is to tell the compelling story of arms and armour through the ages, whether that's through technology or material culture or decorative arts or history or ownership of objects and more. And I guess to make the case, and I'm rather fond of talking about this, that arms and armour is not just about objects in cases or books in libraries. This is about using those objects to unlock the stories of the people who inhabited worlds that teemed with noise and colour. And that's why we've been keen to launch this series. I've worked in academia and in academic publishing, and now in museum publishing, and too often museum staff and university staff travel on parallel tracks without ever looking sideways. And sometimes there's a risk that academics can use museums because it demonstrates impact, or that museums can treat academic research as less relevant because it's not specifically object-based. And one of the aims of this series is to try to turn that around, and I guess to embrace the reality that academics need to engage with objects, whether that's arms and armour or paintings or sculpture or effigies or manuscripts, in order to enrich their work, and that museums need to engage more fully with the theoretical underpinnings of their object interpretations, the different cultural debates that run through different historical periods. That's what we're seeking to do in this series, and that brings us to our book, which I will wave at you, The Medieval Tournament as Spectacle, edited by Alan Murray and Karen Watts. It's a volume that brings together, and I'm just quoting from the blurb on the cover, brings together the latest research on the late medieval tournament. It demonstrates how such events, particularly at the courts of France and Burgundy and England and the German principalities, were increasingly integrated in wider festivities and ceremonies and diplomatic negotiations. And it's a book that tries to do what the series is all about, to bring together both scholars and curators. And so welcome, we can't welcome all of the contributors as we would do if we were in a room together, but contributors include Natalie Anderson and James Beswick and Kathy Blunt and Rosalind Brown Grant and Ralph Moffat and James Titterton and Iason Eleftherios Styriades and Marina Violon. And if you're listening, anybody there, a very warm welcome to you as well. The book chapters, and I'll let the editors cover this in more detail in just a moment, talk about the court of Maximilian I, ideas of honour in the medieval tournament, foot combat equipment, Richard II's Smithfield tournament of 1390, and a lot more. And you should be able to see a link on the YouTube page, which will take you to Boyd Allen Brewer's page. You can get the book at an introductory discount of 50%. You will need to use code BB881. And I'll say that again, BB881. That should give you a 50% discount on the book through the weekend and out the other side. The link is on the page. So that's enough of me talking and introducing the series. It's my pleasure now to be able to introduce the editors. To first hand over to Dr. Alan Murray from the University of Leeds, who's going to set the scene a little bit more and talk more broadly about tournaments in late medieval Europe. So Alan, over to you.
Okay, I hope I'm audible now, please. Thank you. Karen and I were really glad that we could publish this book in the Royal Armouries new series, if for no other reason than so many of the objects that feature in it come from the Armouries collections. And we were really glad to have a wide range of beautiful illustrations of objects that are in the Armouries. I'd like to say a bit about where we are coming from in producing this book. I think if you asked any member of the public, certainly most school children, to say what they associate with the Middle Ages, tournaments would be up there, I think, in the first 10 things. It's something that everybody thinks as being typically medieval. But what do they know about armory, about tournaments? Well, they probably have got impressions that have maybe come from this very famous film, The Knight's Tale. And so they will envisage something like a modern sporting competition, a kind of knockout event with people competing round after round until there's a final victor who is chosen by the judges and then given a prize by a beautiful damsel. And then there'll be big grandstands with lots of cheering supporters. And the only thing that's really missing are the guys going around selling beer and popcorn. It really is so much like modern sporting events. It was not entirely like that because tournaments had a rather different history. And one thing that we often mistake, that we don't get right, is in recognizing the sheer diversity of different tournament forms. And this is one of the things that this book was meant to do. Many years ago, when I was a student, I first became interested in descriptions of tournaments occurring in medieval romances. And in many of these, you'd suddenly find descriptions of tournaments going on for hundreds of lines, in some cases, thousands of lines. When I tried to find out about these, I had the impression that the academics who commented on romances really weren't all that much interested in tournaments. And sometimes they got a bit irritated that the medieval authors would spend so much time talking about them. As opposed to things like courtly love or kingship or piety and so on. But we have to recognize the descriptions of tournaments are there, not only because the poets thought they were important, but because these are what their audiences wanted to hear. So we've got a great deal to do in understanding tournaments. So this volume is really trying to show two things. One is the sheer diversity of different tournament forms and how they operated. And the other is to elucidate a lot of the material culture, the hardware that was associated with tournaments. Now I'm going to let Karen talk about those essays dealing with the material culture. I'll maybe just mention some of the others. So we kick off with a piece by myself, which talks about the original form of the tournament, which is nothing like what you will find in A Knight's Tale. It's the mass battle, the tourney, in which large units of knights practiced maneuvering information and charged each other. And this is really the original form that went on for 100, 200 years or so until others evolved to take part alongside it. We've then got a couple of essays that talk about why people spent so much time and money on tournaments like this. So James Titterton talks about ideas of honour. And this is really important because you could, in the Middle Ages, use tournament to gain social capital, to build up honour in the eyes of your contemporaries, to form important bonds with other people. And tournaments were one of the key nexus in which these bonds operated. And we've got a very detailed investigation of this by James Beswick, which talks about King Richard II. Now, Richard II is often marked down as a bit of a failure as a king. He came to a bad end and Henry IV saw him off. But James Beswick really brings out how Richard, when he achieved his majority, he was keen to throw off the tutelage of the lords who had essentially run the kingdom for him. And he did this by staging a tournament at Smithfield in London, where much of the trappings, the staging, the dramatic functions were all about building up Richard as a figure of authority. We've got two important pieces by Catherine Blunk and Rosalind Brown Grant, which are about the pas d'armes. And this is an interesting form in which tournaments take part in a theatrical setting, especially in 14th and 15th century France and Burgundy. And you can sometimes get the impression that the fighting, the combat, is actually secondary, because there are often very elaborate descriptions of all the things that will be used to provide entertainment, from trees of honor to giants and dwarfs. And there are magnificent descriptions of these things that are really calling out for further research. And the last one that I will mention before handing over is about one character who I would name, if I was asked to nominate the most important tourneyer in the whole of the Middle Ages. Now, there are lots of candidates for this position, and other people will disagree with me, but I would go for Maximilian, King of the Romans and Holy Roman Emperor, because there was nobody who was so enthusiastic about tournaments as he was. He was forever in debt, but he still found huge sums of money to put on tournaments. He owned many armours, many of which survive, and incredibly, he took part in tourneys and jousts himself well into his 40s. So I only have respect for that man. So there you are. I've put my cards on the table. I'm now going to hand on to Karen.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, welcome everybody. I've of course come from a background of armour, the study of material culture. Indeed, I was taken to the Tower of London as a child and fell in love with knights in shining white armour. It was the romance of the thing. But it was the important aspect that delighted me, of course, is that the material culture, the suits of armour, they allow you to see these men as though they've travelled from the past. They're like sculptures in steel, and yet they move. They articulate. It's an old chestnut that if you're not taken from the movies as well, that you need a crane to lift yourself up onto the horse, as seen in Laurence Olivier's Henry V. You don't. You can leap onto your horse unaided. For the tournament armours, you might need a mounting block to rise up onto them. But the equipment is very flexible and it is made to measure. So one of the wonderful things at the Armouries is, of course, the tournament armours of Henry VIII. We can see him evolve from young and fit as he wore them at the Field of Cloth of Gold to larger. And these are wonderful things because you can really see how the articulation works, and you can really see the height and the size of them. Henry VIII was 1.88 meters tall. The armors prove it. So that's the nature of armor, that we do so. But looking at the armor itself that survived for the tournament, extant armor for the tournament only begins in the 14th century, that we can in the 15th century, that we can truly identify as tournament armor. And before then, we need to look at the manuscripts and the illustrations. We need to see these things moving. We need to get an idea of how they were worn. We need to see, as was mentioned, the color and the spectacle and the context for which we're using. This is why this book is so good, because it's interdisciplinary. We can see many other types. How it is build up the picture of how a whole tournament would do. Well, looking at the actual cover of the book, for example, it shows the Manessa Codex, and we can see the climactic moment of triumph. Thank you. The climactic moment of triumph of the tournament, from a wonderful manuscript. And here we've got the jouster on the left, who is holding up his broken lance in triumph. And you can see the shape of the lance, you can see the shield that's protecting him, the van plate, and flying away, just on the other side of the title, is the top of the broken lance with the coronel tip to it that has engaged upon the opponent and broken the lance off, and also toppled his opponent sideways, whom we can see falling from his saddle. But you can also see the stance. They're riding with a very straight leg. You can see the long stirrups and the spurs. And as we zoom in, we can see what he's sitting on. He's sitting on a saddle. That saddle has a rear cantle that is wrapped around him to hold him in place. And cunningly is a light cushion that is there, a vertical padded cushion to protect his thighs. So that's a particular piece of tournament equipment, and one of the first. And these are mentioned by Marina Vialon, who has examined the development of the saddles designed for tournament combat, and making use of these important iconographical evidence, as well as rare surviving material culture. And happily, one of those rare surviving material cultures, in fact, two of them, are in the Royal Armouries collection. And she was instrumental in redating, thanks to her research, she redated the most extraordinary saddle, the biggest saddle that you can imagine, that's in the Royal Armouries collection, a German saddle covered in rawhide that is called the Hohenzoich saddle for the high joust. In fact, it's ridiculous. It raises the jouster above the horse. And so it takes a considerable amount of skill, because he's not well balanced at all. He has to really be able to control the horse and press his knees into the long sweeping front of the saddle. There it is, magnificently. Congratulations. I'm very impressed. The long sweeping side, he pushes into that, and he is seating at that loop that you can see behind, seated behind it. Gloriously, you can see cuts and slashes. You can see where this saddle has actually been used in a tournament. It's got a number of cuts on it and abrasions on it that shows the impact, which is remarkable. So this saddle is about early part of the 15th century, and was called the high saddle. So there were two ways of riding it: the high saddle, or indeed the very low saddle. Now the low saddle and this high saddle here keeps you in, retains you. So it does have the risk of impact that you're breaking your back. But the low saddle on the horse, of which we have an example in the Royal Armouries collection, covered in horn decoration and showing dragons, was this saddle is as yes, thank you. There it is. Hooray! Magnificent thing. Now, as you can see at the back there, the rear cantle just holds you in place, but very slightly, and doesn't stop you flying off the horse in what was called a joust of war. So we have a joust of peace and a joust of war. And the joust of war allows you, using solid lances, to fly off the horse unaided. And this remarkable example is Hungarian, was owned by Sigismund I, Holy Roman Emperor, who came on a visit to England in 1416 and donated it to as a magnificent gift to King Henry V. And it is perhaps one of the oldest objects in the Royal Armouries collection that has been here, that we can since the royal collection was formed. It doesn't help that Henry VIII threw out all the early medieval rubbish to form his new magnificent armoury. But this saddle is truly one of our oldest historic objects. It is covered in dragons and represents the story of St. George and the dragon on it. So this saddle is for the second form of jousting, the joust of war, using the long, sharp lances. Now, lances, they could be over 4 meters long, couched under the right arm, passed over the horse's neck, because the last thing you want to do, forgive me, is hit your own horse. And the competitors passed left side to left side. And in the Armouries collection, we have the Brandon lance, named after Charles Brandon, one of the great tournament competitors of Henry VIII. We also have armours in the collection from Maximilian, Alan's favourite, probably owned by Maximilian himself, for a joust of war, wearing a particular helmet that has reinforcing pieces over the helmet and a big shield over the body. If you hit these parts, they fly off, giving the example of breaking up. The armour is breaking up before your very eyes. And this is wonderful because it reflects that theatrical aspect of tournaments that the spectators wanted to see. They wanted to see something magnificent. They wanted to see something glorious. And these tournaments could not be choreographed. They could be planned, but they could not be choreographed. And accidents did, in fact, often happen. So it is wonderful to see these particular armours, and two of our greatest, given that this year is the 500th anniversary of the Field of Cloth of Gold. And at the Royal Armouries, we have an exhibition and a conference and online resources celebrating this. And one of the articles in the book, actually mine, is about the Field of Cloth of Gold. And extraordinarily, the two armours of Henry VIII have survived. One of them is an all-enclosing, rather looks like a jumpsuit. It's all-enclosing. There is no chink in this armour. It covers the Henry. It would have covered Henry from head to foot, every piece rotating and linking with every other. And the second armour has got a deep skirt to it, and was the one that he actually used at the tournament. And the thing about foot, and these are for foot combat armors, and one of the articles in the book considers the foot combat. Everybody thinks that tournaments are jousting nights. Well, as Alan has already explained, we've got tourneys, the massed mock battles taking place. There is the armor of Henry VIII, called the tonlet armor, for fighting on foot with the big two-handed sword. And there is the other armor with the deadly poleaxe that has got 3 different head types to it: the hook, the hammer, and the spear, that you could use to trip up, to attack your opponent. And this is the armor that was made for Henry VIII to wear at the Field of Cloth of Gold. So the reason why he didn't wear this armor is because the rules were changed. And they were changed because the weapons were altered. So the weapons are an essential part of tournaments because they often dictate the type of armor that you are going to wear. And Yazon Tsoriadis has particularly made a study of the weapons and shows the different forms in which foot combat took part, and he examines the different weapon types as well as their quite specific terminology to this. So that allows you to understand that we've got the tourney, we've got the joust, which is separated off into a joust of war and a joust of peace, and then we have the foot combats where they dismounted and fought on foot. Maximilian in particular was a great exponent of the foot combat and made it a popular aristocratic sport. The armors were fought, the foot combat armors were fought either within an enclosure or over a barrier, which meant that there was no lower leg armor necessary. And we have the armor of the Duke of Saxony, Christian I, which is a magnificent armor that is completely gilt and blued, and is the answer, by the way, to the question, what is the best Christmas present ever? Because this was the Christmas present from his wife to the Duke. In 1591, he must have been looking forward to it tremendously because he would have been measured for it. He knew he was getting this armor. In fact, it's a suite of 12 armors. Sadly, he died in September of that year. He never got his Christmas presents. But the armor shows you precisely how you would fight. Foot combat armors are symmetrical, often worn with a visor that has a lot of breathing holes in it, because the one great problem with armor is the problem of overheating and the necessity to breathe. So as many breathing holes are put in it as possible, and foot combat armors are symmetrical about their central axis, whereas jousting armors and tourney armors are asymmetrical. For a start, one side has to be, the right side has to be open to allow you to couch the lance underneath it. And of course, the left side, which is the primary target, is the problem. It has to be heavily reinforced with extra plates called a grand guard, a pass guard, and a manifer, covering the shoulder, the arm, and the hand in consequence. So these armors are particularly specialized, and a great deal of study has gone into identifying which form of combat these are for. There are locking gauntlets that lock onto the sword, so you cannot let it go. Even if you release your fingers, the gauntlet will retain and hold on to the weapon. This was primarily used for the tourney or massed combat. You have helmets that lock onto the collar so that you can move your head in a limited way, but protects the neck. In the cover of the book, indeed, you can see a reinforcing plate right across the neck to protect that vulnerable area of damage. And of course, above all, you need a visor that is protecting your sight. The sights are slender and narrow, but you can see perfectly well in front of you. And as you rise on the horse, you can see above, and as you fall, you see below. And the brain reconstructs all three images to form a rectangular view of the whole. It's an extraordinary feature. However, it's terribly important that you actually close your visor. The French King Henry II died because he didn't close his visor properly and got a lance through the face and the eye. And Henry VIII in 1524 also didn't close his visor properly and got a splinterful of lance in his face. He nearly died, but with sheer bravura got back on his horse and ran another 6 courses. This may have he probably may have sustained some brain damage during this, and he certainly suffered from severe headaches from this point onwards. And there is some argument about whether this has actually changed him as a person. And however, of course, his greatest tournament of all was the Field of Cloth of Gold, held in 1520 between himself and Francis I, King of France, and all their court and retinue, held in an area of northern France. The two kings did not joust against each other because there would be a loss of face. So they jousted as brothers in arms against competitors from each other's court. And so we can see that the equipment, from saddles to armor to weapons, are a vital part in the study of this book, but also to the study of the manuscripts and the illustrations and the descriptions of them. And indeed, Ralph Moffat has been a particular study of these pieces. And I wanted to close with this because it wasn't always approved of the armours. And Ralph mentions that, and I quote, by the 1440s, Alonso, Bishop of Burgos in the Kingdom of Castile, would rail against knights who concentrated their efforts on, quote, having many arms, or in changing the conformation of them and devoting one's energy to discovering new pieces of armour and giving them new names, so that if our ancestors arose from the dead, they would not understand them. And Ralph concludes by saying, descendants as well as ancestors find themselves in this same predicament. As more sources come to light, our understanding will improve. We can but hope that many more documents and even examples of early jousting arms and armour will be discovered. And this is one of the points of this book. It is a source book. There is a wonderful bibliography that is the starting point for anybody wanting to study the subject. But what we hope is that it will inspire you all to more research in this wonderful and exciting field. Thank you very much, and I pass you back to Martyn.
Karen, thank you very much. And you did something that I failed to do earlier, which was to mention the bibliography, which is a remarkable resource and took an awfully long time to put together. So I think that's a value in itself. There's lots of questions coming in. I just want to see if I can theme one or two of them together. Alan, maybe just this might be directed to Alan. I'm guessing. Just in terms of the source material, Alan, how early do we find tournaments, and specifically how early do we find foot combats actually appearing in the records? Now, obviously, we've locked down the book to 1100 to 1600, but how early do we actually find them in the records?
For tournaments in general, we really get mentions in chronicles from, I would say, the early 12th century. But these tend to be very brief. And because most of the Latin texts were written by clerics, they tend to be rather disapproving. Clerics did not like knights going off fighting each other for totally frivolous reasons. And it took some time before we got vernacular texts in French to start off with, and then in other languages. The absolute most wonderful text is the Histoire de Guillaume le Maréchal, about a remarkable character, William Marshal, Earl of Pembroke, who was one of Henry II's leading nobles. And he spent much of his early youth as, you could say, a professional tourneyer. He was a poor serving knight. He didn't have much wealth to his name, and so he used to hire himself out to various lords, and eventually to Henry the young king, the eldest son of Henry II. And he and his pals went around the tournament circuit in northern France, and they took part, and they tried to win ransoms by capturing other people, and horses. And these were all divided up and apportioned at the end of the day's fighting, which is why after one tournament, William could say he had won 3.5 horses. These were actually whole horses, but they had to be divided when they were sold. But this means, I mean, this is an absolutely exceptional text. There is nothing else like it. And so for much of the 12th and 13th centuries, we are really reliant on imaginative literature by poets such as Chrétien de Troyes, Wolfram von Eschenbach, Hartmann von Aue, who give descriptions of tournaments that are essentially fictitious, but these had to be believable in order to appeal to the audiences who were listening to these stories being recited or read aloud. And this is why in my own piece, I have tried to evaluate the tournament descriptions in many of these authors. Now, foot combat is a bit different because it didn't really come along as a discrete event until I suspect very late 14th century. The 15th century is the great heyday of the foot combat, and then going on into the 16th. And then we do have, by this time, with the flowering of vernacular literature, we have more descriptions of how this operated. So I hope that answers the question to some extent, but Karen may want to come in.
No, absolutely. The only thing I wanted to come in is with my favourite quote about early tournament participation by Roger of Howden, who said, "He is not fit for battle that has never seen his own blood flow, who has not heard his teeth crunch under the blow of an opponent, or felt the full weight of his adversary upon him."
Yeah, see, me working from home in my back bedroom makes me feel rather feeble by comparison. Karen, question. I think it's a great question because about the early concepts of health and safety. The question, I'm just trying to summarise it, about the danger of injury from the saddle, which was presumably all part of the learning curve for saddle makers. But would they be penalised for their customers getting hurt if they made particular innovations? I guess what's the legal comeback on the person who makes the saddle if the person does themselves a mischief in the middle of the tournament?
Yeah, that's a good question, but I'm afraid that I'm pleased to say that the saddler himself, and indeed the armourer, would have had no comeback at all, because there is a close relationship in the conception of the armour and saddle between patron and armourer. So the patron had an opportunity to try it out, see that it worked, see that he was comfortable. Of course, all of these would have been fitted so closely. So it's really his fault if he hasn't anticipated something, or that it hasn't worked. So happily, yes, of course, accidents happened because of the sheer violence of the sport, and the fact that a shiver of a lance could just enter your eye, or just the lance could hit your arm and your gauntlet, and the gauntlet may not resist or hold. As regards the saddles, going back to the origin of the question, that's why they have high cantles at the front, and that's why right from the start they developed this little cushion. So the knights would not just be comfortable, but that it would help absorb a blow. Of course, because the accidents keep happening, this is why the arms and armour evolved through centuries, constantly changing, because an accident has happened and that wasn't predicted, and we need to find some solution to make it even better.
Useful. Okay, and that's right. I mean, buyer beware is the answer to the question, especially. Karen, just another one I think is probably better directed at you, and Field of Cloth of Gold might be a good example here. But given how expensive a suit of armour can be at the high end, when do you hear what weapons are going to be used at a particular tourney? Or do you just take several sort of things in your suitcase just to be certain that you've got everything that you need? What's the planning procedure like?
Oh, the planning procedure. Well, the planning procedure always begins with traditionally a tournament would be planned. Heralds would be sent out to each other's court, and this is exemplified. The whole planning procedures are in a wonderful manuscript that is referenced in the book by René of Anjou, which is a theatrical. It's basically his book is how to hold a tournament, and it shows all that planning part of it, that shows that you send the heralds out and you have agreed, and at that point you agree what weapons you are going to use and what armor you are going to use and what combat, and then something called an emprise is written out, which is the rules. And in the book, we've got the rules and regulations as was agreed and set out for the Field of Cloth of Gold. Now, this plan went slightly awry with the Field of Cloth of Gold. I think it's rather slightly, everyone blames the French, but I do think it's rather Henry's fault, because he, before the tournament, while they're preparing, he sends a magnificent gift to Francis I. And this is a heavy sword called a pesant sword that hasn't been seen before. In fact, Francis I wheels it about and says, I can't possibly use this. And it's pointed out then that what he's missing is an important gauntlet that Henry has devised himself, again, showing the link between patron and armourer. And you need to use this particular gauntlet. So Francis asks for the gauntlet to be sent along. And at this point, the French changed the rules. And instead for the foot combat, using the great and dangerous poleaxe, for which Henry has had this magnificent suit of armour made, the French, who are allowed to do so, specify a different weapon and say, well, we could use the light sword, we can use a two-handed sword, or we can use this heavy pesant sword. And for this reason, the Henry VIII's armour had to be changed. So from that all-in-one jumpsuit affair that we saw, that is remarkably heavy, the armour had to be changed to one which we could use a two-handed sword or a pesant sword for it. The other thing that has been said is that the French heard of this engineering marvel that Henry VIII's own armourers had produced in his Greenwich workshop, where every piece interlocked with every other, and Francis didn't have something similar. So I'm not sure that is the case, but that is one of the old myths that have surrounded the fact that the armours were changed at only 3 months before the tournament. It's a remarkable feat that an armour was put together for Henry VIII in 3 months. Indeed, they had to use parts of earlier armours, such as the helmet and the legs, that he had from other armours and match the whole lot together. But the cuirass and the deep skirt or tonlet was made especially. They didn't, however, finish the decoration just before the tournament, and there's a mistake in the decoration.
Yes, there is. Let's leave that and let's come back to that in a bit. Alan, a couple of
Can
questions.
I come in on this?
Oh, go on, please.
Yeah, I think when we consider issues of safety, we have to remember that tournaments were never originally conceived as sport. It's easy to get that impression, but they were actually very serious. They were about practice for war. And this is why the tourney was such a serious business. It was about learning to ride in formation, to stick together. It was about the practicing the great knightly tactic. The dominant feature in the battlefields of the 12th, 11th centuries, 13th century, were formations of heavily armored knights riding knee to knee with a charge that really would sweep away many enemies unless they met a similar force that was equally well armed and equally courageous. But this is not an easy maneuver to pull off. You had to practice this. And if, imagine two groups of knights clashing and breaking up, it was then important to be able to reform the unit and get back in order to fight again. So the convention was that you're not supposed to kill your opponents, but you're allowed to do pretty much anything else. And it was must have been an intimidating experience, because we've got units of people charging each other, but then these would break up. And it was perfectly permissible for a bunch of knights to turn on one isolated individual and then just hack away at him. Now imagine you're there on your own, you're wearing a great helm, and you've got 5 or 6 guys beating you with swords. I'm not quite sure how much of that you could stand before you would surrender. And this aspect brings out some of the, or one of the big contradictions about tournaments that were important in their development, because the reason for being was to practice formations. But while doing that, you could also win prizes, ransoms, horses, and you could gain glory. And these two things aren't really exactly aligned, because you could only practice warfare by being one of the unit and doing what everybody else did, but you could only gain ransoms and take prisoners and win glory by doing things for yourself and standing out. And I think this contradiction was one of the big factors in producing the joust as a separate event. And the joust really took off in the 13th century and then began to acquire all of these additional characteristics that we've seen in some of the essays that we've talked about so far.
That's really helpful, and it actually just connects up to one of the questions which has come in, Alan, which is at what point did the passage of arms start to become popular, and to what extent did literary depictions of tournaments influence how actual tournaments were staged?
This is one of the big questions in tournament studies, and I don't claim that we have all the answers in this book, because again, if you look at popular depictions of tournaments in films and Sir Walter Scott and so on, the jousting is often shown like a kind of sporting event. But that may be true, but it's only true of the way that jousts originated. And the first evidence we've got for jousts is actually before the mass tourney, because knights would turn up in their hundreds, usually in advance of the appointed day, and they were kicking their heels. And they thought, oh, well, they're raring to go, but they didn't always want to wait until the actual day of the tourney when they'd be divided into big formations. And so they would just actually start impromptu jousting one-on-one in the days before the tournament. And that seems to have taken place without any kind of literary framework. And it's only when the joust then came to be run as a distinct event of its own that we find a literary framework. But as far as I can see, from the very first mentions of jousts in the early 13th century, there is always some sort of literary framework there. And so people, these would be announced or described as being something like a round table, so with an Arthurian theme. Now, unfortunately, we don't quite know if there was a great deal of staging or props or anything, but people thought that it was necessary to have a kind of literary backstory, if you like. The Padam, the passage of arms, that really takes off in the 15th century, that's when the whole literary framework takes off. And in the descriptions of the rules that were circulated beforehand that Karen mentioned, we have pages and pages of descriptions saying what shall happen on the actual day. So in one of the Royal Armouries' own manuscripts, we've got the passage of arms of the golden tree. Am I right with this one, where we are told that there shall be a lady standing beside the golden tree, and then a dwarf will come and release a giant from his chain, and the giant shall blow a horn, and so on. And the description of the literary framework goes on for pages and pages, and then at some point we're told, and there shall be jousting. So it's almost as if the literary framework is actually far more important than the joust.
Oh, can I just skip in here? Alan, can you tell us about Ulrich?
Ulrich von Liechtenstein, he's probably my second favourite jouster in the Middle Ages. A quite remarkable man who also features in the movie The Knight's Tale, which gets almost everything wrong about him. He really existed. He lived from around about 1200 to maybe 1260, 1270, thereabouts. And a quite remarkable man, because he spent much of his early life attending Tourneys, but he seems to have invented something that was quite new, which was a jousting tour. Sometime in the 1220s, he proclaimed to most of the countries in the southeast of the Holy Roman Empire that he was going to travel from Venice, from Venice to the Bohemian frontier, which he would arrive at 30 days later, and he would joust against all comers. So this was a tour in which there'd be jousts along the way. And the most amazing thing about this was that he was going to joust in the costume of the goddess Venus. So here we have another literary framework that was being used. Now, I don't think that anybody for a moment believed that this was a real woman riding around. It was an open secret, and everybody thought it was a great joke, but they all came along and they all jousted with Ulrich, and a great time was had by all.
Karen, I'm glad you set him up for that one. That was great.
Yes.
There's some questions. I'm conscious of the clock, and let me just see if I can get through one or two of the questions. I don't want people to feel as if they've been overlooked. A couple of quick ones, Karen. What about left-handers? Do you have a left-handed suit of armour?
Nope. You were required to overcome it and joust right-handed, because you had to pass left side to left side with the jousting. That doesn't mean to say that they weren't taught to use a weapon in each hand, actually. So for some forms of foot combat, there was always a possibility, and they were trained to use a dagger in the left hand. So you could combat with two weapons, one in each hand. So that's your answer.
Thank you. And again, Karen, just to you again, although I may be misfiring these questions at the wrong person, just in terms of the differences in rank, how do you compete without the risk of losing face if you lose to somebody of a lower rank than you? Henry VIII's great get out of jail card, I suppose.
Yes, what's interesting is that we have an idea that squires are like youths, unknighted and young, but there are some very famous jousts between squires of noble birth and of high rank. There was a tendency to joust. Your opponent is chosen according to experience. Henry VIII complained if he didn't get good enough opponents, but also rank. So that is certainly true, that you are jousting against somebody who is of similar rank to a limited degree. After all, Henry VIII is King of England, and his favourite jousting companion was Charles Brandon, admittedly his brother-in-law, but not king, dukes. So within that limited framework, yes, they fought together. And of course, the other great jouster that one should mention is one who had no noble rank at all, and was Anthony, the great bastard of Burgundy. And I'm not swearing. That is actually his title. His official title was great. There was a lesser bastard of Burgundy as well. He was the great bastard of Burgundy and one of the greatest jousters in the land. And so all wanted to joust against him, including quite high nobility.
This, and if I can come back to Maximilian, this is an aspect that comes out in Natalie Anderson's essay. Maximilian, although he was the sovereign of the Holy Roman Empire, he jousted against people who were a good bit below him in rank, dukes, counts, and so on. And he left tournament books where he had each encounter painted. And so we have on each page a pair of knights. And the painting will actually show you what happened, in that one of the knights was often unhorsed, and this was often Maximilian. And he's there lying on the ground because his opponent has beaten him. Now, you'd think, really, does the emperor want to show himself being beaten by somebody else, being unhorsed? And the answer is, well, if he was willing to record this for posterity, being unhorsed didn't matter. It was taking part. And the big thing about Maximilian and his jousting was he was using this as a form of social bonding to develop bonds and links with key people in his empire. And the fact that you jousted against an emperor or somebody else was a great honor. And honor, I keep coming back to this, is the great imponderable factor in secular society in the Middle Ages. You can accumulate honor in all sorts of ways. You can lose it as well. But one of the ways you can build up honor is just by the fact that, you know, King Henry VIII jousted with me. What an amazing honor. And you could live off that for a long time.
Do you, just going down some more of the questions, and Alan, maybe again to you, do you think that the banning of tournaments during periods of political unrest are deliberately to stop knights meeting to plot? Person who's asked the question is thinking particularly of the reign of Edward II as a time when there was a lot of political unrest in high places.
It depends on which country is involved. I think the earliest prohibitions on tournaments were usually pronounced by the church, who thought they were wrong because they encouraged vanity and killing for no good purpose. And of course, the knights took no blind bit of notice. England, I think, is a special case because in England, the kings were keen to keep a very tight grip on tournaments. And we see this especially in the 13th century when there was a lot of baronial opposition and even some revolts. And so tournaments were banned because they were a good pretext for plotting. I think that did happen in some cases. But also, I think the kings of England were not too keen on having large bodies of armed men gathering at different points in the country. And so the Kings of England later developed a form of licensing of tournaments, which meant that tournaments were only allowed to take place in a few places in the kingdom with royal permission. But it's interesting, remember the Kings of England also were lords of major chunks of France, and they weren't bothered about tournaments there. They were quite happy for tournaments to happen in France. But England was the key to the monarchy because that's where the money came from. And so the kings wanted to keep tournaments on a very tight rein. It probably also had something to do with the fact that the earlier kings were not big fans of tournaments themselves. Mm. And that changed when we got to people like the Edwards, Edward I, Edward III, especially, were really keen on organising and presiding over tournaments. And then we see them working in a rather different way because there is a direct royal involvement.
Helpful. Thank you for that very much. Just on the subject of money, as questions come in, Karen, it might be one for you. I think you've touched on it, at least in conversations you and I have had in the past, about what happened when people were ransomed. Was there a code or a system of ransom prices, a sliding scale of what you had to pay for somebody?
Again, it was agreed at each tournament in advance what you were likely to win, whether you were going to, so Alan has touched on William Marshall, you could capture the knight and all his equipment and could include the horse as well. Alternatively, prizes were agreed and set out in advance, and could be jewels, could be actual money, and certainly could be equipment. I'm sure that in the case of William Marshall, he was ransoming the stuff back immediately in order to get money. You know, arms and armor have a high money value, so it would have been. I'm sure he would have just ransomed it straight back to the owner for a high price. So that's the nature of the prizes. Yeah.
Also, the ransoming and capturing horses were really a feature of the mass tourney. That was the convention that whatever you captured, you could either keep or sell back to the owners. There was nothing like this really, as far as I can see, in the joust or the pas d'armes. That ransoms were not really a feature of this. And I think this was one of the reasons why jousting became so popular, because you could go along and take part without the risk that you might end up totally impoverished. So money was not a big feature in the joust, apart from actually having to gain the equipment. And there were prizes, of course, but these were not big monetary prizes. They were often things that just had a kind of symbolic value, because the key thing was that you were the victor and you were seen to be the victor. And that would be the thing that people remembered.
Yes.
Interesting. Karen, I keep meaning to ask you this one. If Alan wants to claim Maximilian, although I see Natalie in the chat function and I think she'd want to claim Maximilian instead, who will you claim?
Oh, I'm going to have to claim Henry VIII. Of course I am. He was wonderful. He was joyous. He was enthusiastic. I mean, he's 29 at the Field of Cloth of Gold. He loves tournaments. He loves combat. And he took, and enthusiastically took part in all of them. I mean, that's another feature that is interesting, is the extent to which he was the born sportsman. He was not only good at the classic aristocratic sports of hunting and tournaments, but he was also a very fine tennis player. And he also even played football. We have a record of his football boots. So he was the perfect all-round sportsman. So for that, I like it. And the sheer joy and enthusiasm with which he took part in everything. He even at the Field of Cloth of Gold broke all the regulations, having done extremely well at the archery, which again Francis I had taken no part in at all, and was surprised that Henry VIII would do archery, but Henry was a very fine longbowman, and carried off by the elan and the thrill of having done so well at the archery, he puts his arms round Francis I and challenges him to a wrestling match, to the horror of the rest of the court. This was actually in a private evening event, a private part of the tournament. And Francis agreed immediately and swiftly threw Henry to the ground, so, which must have annoyed Henry no end. But you know, he was a terrific sportsman, and for that, I love him to bits for that.
Time is just beginning to push us, and I'm conscious there's one or two questions that we haven't covered off, but also that they probably will continue to be so, because I'm scanning up and down these. Just last one for each of you, really, and it's a bit of a frivolous one. Obviously, the Royal Armouries is the place that you would want to come and see tournament equipment and objects. But if you were picking somewhere else that people in a world where there were no travel restrictions could go and look at objects, where would you want to go? Alan, maybe first, and Karen afterwards. Just wherever you. Oh, you want Karen to answer? Fine. Karen can answer the question.
All right. Now, back to Alan's great favourite, Maximilian. One of the greatest collections of tournament armour, and certainly of the German period, of the 15th century on, and especially of Maximilian, is held in Vienna, in the Hofjagd- und Rüstkammer Sammlung. In Vienna. So that is one of the great ones. And of course, I cannot fail to mention the Musée de l'Armée in Paris, which is the French national collection of arms and armour, and which houses the only English Greenwich armour in France, which was a gift from Henry VIII to the Maréchal de Fleuranges, after Henry VIII had spectacularly broken the other chap's pauldron or shoulder defence. And then, thrilled to bits, he gave a gift of a whole suit of armour specially made for the Maréchal de Fleuranges from his own armoury workshop. So that is the other great centre for armour. There is also Berlin and Madrid and Turin and a number of other armouries, but those are and the Metropolitan Museum in New York, of course.
I like how you covered off those as well. That was very good. Thank you both very much indeed for comments and conversation and such an enlightening session. If I've overlooked your question by scanning up and down my WhatsApp messages, then I do apologise. But please use our inquiries at theroyalarmouries.org email if you are keen to have it answered. A reminder again of the discount for the book, a whole 50% off. If you use the link that's on the YouTube page, it will be there. I think the link will be there for a while, but the discount will continue until just after the weekend. If I can mark your card for one or two future events that we are hosting next Friday, part 2 of our online conference to mark 500 years since the Field of Cloth of Gold tournament, which we've talked about already. 3 papers coming up. One which is ostensibly our keynote for the conference, from Richard Barber, who will be well known to anyone connected with Boydell and Brewer, of course. Also Keith Dowan from the Royal Armouries and Maria. So that's next Friday, 25th of September. And then on the 30th of September, Natasha Bennett, who's Curator of Oriental Collections at the Armouries, will be speaking on Crusader arms and armour from Africa and Asia. And details about that are online. If I can tempt you with our new Royal Armouries membership scheme, all sorts of exciting benefits and goodies, airlifted donuts and things, well, maybe not that actually, that's the thing I want them to put in, but all sorts of exciting benefits. All the details for that are also at royalarmouries.org. And if you are interested in going a bit further in your reading about tournaments and medieval arms and armour, then other Royal Armouries books, both print and digital, can be found at shop.royalarmouries.org. I will make my normal plea. Please, please, please buy your books direct from the publishers rather than from certain online retailers. That's the only way in which we actually begin to make any money back. If it goes to Amazon, it will be a crying shame, I think. That's my plea. I will make it every time we do a session like this. So it only remains for me to say thank you to Alan and to Karen for not only contributing this afternoon, but also for all their enormous work on the book. To the other contributors who have been flashing up and down in the chat function on YouTube, big hello and a big thank you to everybody who's been involved, to Caroline and Elizabeth and everybody else at Boydell and Brewer, to Adam, who's been making sure that I can't blow up the internet during the course of this session, and just to wish you all a very safe and enjoyable weekend. Thank you very much.